Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live sessions at the Reactor. My name is Rav, and I'm the program manager at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. Please be mindful, please be kind, considerate in the way you engage. The chat will be open throughout, and we do encourage all of you to participate. We're back with another episode of 10 Tuesdays to AZ900, and today is episode 6. If you missed out on the previous episodes, I'm adding a link to the playlist in the chat, so please make sure that you go and visit and look at all the other episodes, all the previous episodes. So just remember, we've finished with 5 episodes already. This is the 6th one, and today we're going to be talking about Azure Directory and Identity Platform. During this session, Johan will also talk about giving away some exam vouchers, so please do stick around for the whole session. He might talk about that in the middle, and it's entirely up to him. But yeah, just stick around for that announcement. And with that, I'm now going to bring up Johan onto the stream. Hey, Johan.
Perfect. Hello. Thanks for that. Thanks for the intro. As usual, good evening or good morning or, good whatever and wherever you are. It's Johan here, and welcome to day 6 or episode 6, if you like to call it that, of our 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals. So today we're predominantly going to be talking about Azure Identity, Azure Active Directory for that matter. And we'll talk a little bit about access, a little bit about security. And you'll notice if we've got some links on the bottom here that'll essentially link you to the Microsoft Learn content, right? So AZ900, episode 06, LM, and that'll take you through to the Microsoft Learn platform, where you'll essentially, be allowed to actually work through this content at your own pace. Right, so without any further ado here, let me just get into this. So my name is Jan Meiberg. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK, originally from South Africa, as you might recognize from the accent. I've got my email address there. I've got my Twitter handle. I've got my LinkedIn profile, aka.ms/Johan. I'm kind of resident just outside of London in a place called Loughton, very close to the Epping Forest, very into sort of anything to do with water. And, we're spending quite a bit of time sort of mountain biking around this forest as well. So in this session, we're going to be covering quite a couple of things, actually. We will predominantly focus on Azure Active Directory, right? I've abbreviated it here, which is not ideal as far as I'm concerned, but I don't have a lot of space in terms of, writing out reams of text. I also don't want to just sort of spam the screen with, large amounts of text. So we'll go into each of these individually, most of them at least, and we will look at Azure AD from just a high-level perspective. We will chat a little bit about hybrid identities and how you can achieve something like a hybrid identity. We will then also talk a little bit about external identities, guests that you might invite to your environment. Then we will spend some time around multifactor authentication, role-based access control, and then we will delve a little bit deeper into conditional access. What is conditional access and how you can, what you can do with conditional access and why it's actually so important. And then the last 2 or 3 sessions there or sections there, you'll see that we will focus a little bit on zero trust, why zero trust is so important and why it's different from what you might have been doing from a security perspective in the past. And then, defense in depth, where, we'll essentially travel down the OSI layer and just talk about the different concepts behind, the security in that OSI layer. And last but certainly not least, I've got a little bit of a demo around Defender for Cloud. That's essentially a service we've got inside of Azure. But before we get into that, I like to always start with this slide here, right? This is a pretty sort of great and solid image. It covers most of what Azure Active Directory is. Now, I'm gonna just briefly sort of talk about the different components. Some of them we will go a lot deeper in, some of them we won't. But it's important to understand that Azure Active Directory is not Windows Active Directory, right? Of course, Microsoft sort of in the 2000s shipped Windows Server with a component called Windows Active Directory Services, right, which was a LDAP-based directory, which essentially replaced our old sort of binary, identity management solution that we kind of ran on premises. So Azure Active Directory is not an extension of that, right? Azure Active Directory was a rewrite for cloud-based authentication with cloud-based protocols in mind, right? So we didn't just take some domain controllers and stick them into the cloud, and there you go. Now you've got a cloud-based identity management system. Azure AD is a cloud-native HTTP and HTTPS-based solution that leverages modern authentication protocols like OAuth, right, and those sort of services. So it's it integrates actually with your on-premises Azure Active Directory by means of a Connect service, right? We've got Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is essentially an agent that you can install and deploy on premises that will essentially replicate some of your data from on-prem into Azure AD. Now, this typically could be something like users and groups, though I have to mention that we typically don't synchronize everything from on-prem, right? If you're running things like, for example, SharePoint, Exchange Server on premises, you might not want all those user accounts, those system user accounts that you're using on-prem. You might not want all of those accounts in the cloud, all the groups related to those services. You might not want them. So our Connect tool will essentially allow you to segregate and to filter in and filter out certain users and certain groups that you might want in the cloud, and certain that you don't, users and groups that you just might want on premises. So we've got a pretty solid sort of, hybrid story there. Excuse me. Then we've also got some device sort of, abilities as well. Now, if you're running anything from Windows 10 and above, we've essentially got the ability to take your Windows 10 plus device and join it with Azure AD. This implies that I can go and add a business or a school account directly onto my Windows 10 plus device. And this gives me a single sign-on capability, very similar to the device join capability that we typically had on premises, right? So if you're thinking of connecting your laptop, for example, we can go and add our laptop, and connect our laptop, for example, running Windows 10 plus, directly to Azure AD. And this gives me the ability to do a single sign-on on the device with my Azure AD and inherently synchronized identity from on-prem as well. On top of that, we can also connect other devices, right? So I can bring, for example, my with a bring your own device sort of policy, I can bring my Apple device, I can bring my Android device, and I can link these up with Azure AD as well. You'll still sign in with credentials on the device, but we will provide you with some level of single sign-on from those devices to access certain services and resources that you might want to access through those accounts. Now, this also gives us a management capability and some footprint to be able to reset the device should the device go missing or something like that. So there are some capabilities around that as well. And this is essentially part of what Azure AD provides, right? The ability for me to group together users based on the device that they're on, for example. We've also got some great integration from a B2C and B2B capability. I'll touch a little bit in more detail on this later on, but essentially, whenever you've got partners or even customers that you might want to give access to certain resources, you might, for example, have some partners that you want to manage part of your workloads in the cloud. Or you might want to give some of your customers access to your calendar, for example, right? Or access to Teams or access to something like SharePoint online, just as an example. And to this end, I can actually bring my users in as a guest account. And that implies that all the rules with regards to authentication still applies from their tenant, but I can through that, so they're still signing through their tenant, but I can give them access to our environment using what's known as a guest account. And we will also talk about that in a bit more detail later on. We've also got integration with a bunch of other and third-party identity providers. This is essentially the leverage that we're getting because we are, we've built Azure AD based on open internet-based standards and protocols, right? OAuth, OpenID Connect, these sort of things. And this really allows me to authenticate to third-party services via Azure AD or access my Azure AD services and components by authenticating against another identity provider, right? So for example, I might be using, my organization might be using something like Salesforce. I can authenticate to Salesforce through Azure AD, but I can also access my Azure AD information or Microsoft Cloud related information by offsetting that authentication to something like Facebook, for example, right? Google Identity, etc. So you'll see that we've got arrows pointing in both directions here. So either you're offsetting, that authentication to another identity provider, or you are using Azure AD to connect and interact with services that maybe sit outside of your environment, right? Salesforce.com, just as an example. And then on top of all of this, and maybe it might have been worth starting with this, but you'll see that on top of all of that, Azure AD also provides the identity platform for the other Microsoft Cloud services, right? So think, for example, of Microsoft 365, right, where we've got things like SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, etc. The minute you enable one of our cloud services, whether it's Dynamics, Microsoft 365, any of our cloud-related services will essentially establish an Azure AD for the identity component behind those cloud-based services, right? So Azure AD really becomes the cornerstone of your tenant if you are running Azure, if you are running Microsoft 365, if you are running something like Dynamics 365, right? Azure AD is kind of the identity and the glue behind all of these things that essentially link all these things together and make them all, gives you that single sign-on across all those cloud services, but also across on-prem services as well. And that brings me to this top section, which is probably a little bit more important, maybe not for the Azure Fundamentals exam, but if you're an administrator, some of these things are going to be, requirements that you specifically have to ensure that your data is more secure, that your environment is more secure, that you have defense in depth, right? If I think, for example, of things like conditional access is that capability, and we'll delve into a bit more detail later on, where we can go and specify the rules of when we want to prompt the user, for example, for multifactor authentication. Think of a user that might be accessing the Azure portal inside the browser. Maybe we are forcing multifactor authentication whenever a guest user is accessing the portal, right? So you can go and build out the exact, quite granular rules to ensure that we can really prompt for additional authentication mechanisms should we have that as a requirement under those circumstances. We've also got multi-factor authentication, and again, I'll touch on all of these in a little bit more detail later on. The ability to prompt, for example, for your your authenticator app on your mobile device, which we know that if you've signed in on the authenticator app on your mobile device, we're pretty sure that you are who you say you are, right? And of course, Azure AD also provides you with that ability to give access to certain resources, right? We've got a role-based management system behind Azure AD, so I can place you in a certain role and I can connect that role up with a certain area of Azure, and that means that we can give you, quite granular permissions, or permissions at a higher level that will essentially inherit down if you want to also do role-based access control. And the last two are also quite interesting. Privileged identity management, and I'll see if I can demo this as well, is that ability for us to say, well, I don't necessarily want my user administrators to always operate with the full user administrator permission, right? So I can go and place those users in PIM, as it's called, or privileged identity management. I can go and place them in certain roles, and then they have to essentially ask and escalate their permissions when they want to use that capability, right? So if you're thinking of the concept of least privilege, PIM is essentially one of those tools that we can use to ensure that your users don't actually operate on the environment with the elevated permissions. They essentially have to ask for those elevated permissions, and then you can assign it to them for a period of time, right? Have it approved, etc. And then on top of that, we've also got identity protection, the ability for us, for example, to look at sign-in risks, right? Someone that signed in from Australia and 20 minutes later they sign in from South Africa. You're going to have to fly really fast from Australia to do that, right? So that will typically be seen as a high-risk sign-in. So based on all sorts of rules and criteria, we can decide, but under these conditions, this is very risky. So prompt the user for a multi-factor sign-in, right? Even though it is not something that is normally required, right? So we can go and decide what are those rules and what are those thresholds that we want to ensure that under these circumstances, we don't want the user to just sign in with a username and a password, for example, right? We want to prompt the user for some additional authentication mechanisms. All right, so this is Azure AD at a very high level, and I'm now going to just see if I can dig a little bit deeper into some of these aspects. So we've got a tool called Azure AD Connect, and Azure AD Connect is typically going to enable single sign-on for you by synchronizing some of your usernames and groups from your on-prem environment. As I mentioned, this is essentially an agent that you can deploy on premises. It requires line of sight with all your domain controllers. Well, not all of them, with at least the domain controllers in the forest that you need access to. And this will essentially allow us to synchronize select users and groups into the cloud. So those accounts will now exist in Azure AD as well, and we will keep them synchronized with on-prem. We've got a couple of authentication options there. Among them, you'll see towards the bottom here, we've got a password hash sync option, right? Now, we are not synchronizing the password into the cloud. In fact, what we're actually doing is we are synchronizing the hash of a hash of the password into the cloud. So we're never really storing your password inside of Azure AD, right? All we are doing is we are storing the hash of the hash with a bit of salt as well, if you're a security person. And that implies that if the user types in their password in the cloud and we create the hash of that hash with the salt on top of that, and it matches what has been synchronized, it implies that it is the same password. So we've got enough security gates in place there to ensure that the password is not essentially stored in the cloud, right? That we're actually only synchronizing metadata, if you like, about the password into the cloud. We've also got something called pass-through authentication, where pass-through authentication is that ability for us to say, well, we always want the user to be authenticating against our on-premises Active Directory. So I can access a cloud resource that will prompt the user for authentication information. We will validate that authentication information against an on-prem Active Directory, and then give the user access to the resources, right? So that's known as pass-through authentication. It's another option that we've got when we set up the Azure AD Connect synchronization tool. And then last but certainly not least, we've also got federation, the ability for you to federate your Azure AD with multiple on-prem Active Directory forests, if that was one of those requirements that you had. I don't think it's necessary to go into too much detail here with regards to the authentication options. Just be aware of the fact that we've got a whole host of different options there. And as you can see there, what we've essentially got is we've got our on-premises Active Directory. This is the directory on premises that's storing the usernames and groups and passwords. And then we've got that sync tool that is essentially synchronizing the users and groups from the on-prem environment into Azure AD. And that gives me the ability to sign in the cloud without ever having to go on-prem to authenticate my users. I'm going to demonstrate this quickly if it's all the same to you. I've got some, let me just go for Azure Active Directory here. I've got some users here. Now this is on a specific tenant that I got set up just to demonstrate this specific part. And you will see here that I've got a field there that says on-premises synchronized. So that user and that user for that matter were users that were created in an Active Directory on-prem, and I synchronized them at some point in time with Azure AD, right? You'll also notice that I've got something called user type, right? And my user type is either going to be a member or my user type is going to be a guest. If it says guest, it implies that the user was invited to my Azure AD and that they've most likely got another Azure AD set up for their company or for their customer or whatever that entity is, and their user account essentially lives in that environment, right? Or you might even be using something like, a Microsoft account, right? Think of Xbox accounts and Skype accounts, those sort of things. All right, so I'm not going to come back to this. You'll notice here that we've got the user type, which implies the user is either a member here or a guest. And we've got the on-premises synchronized option, and you'll see that implies that the user account was essentially synchronized from the on-prem environment into Azure AD. On top of that, we've also got external identities, right? And to come back to that guest user that I was talking about, we've got a couple of options here, right? We've got something called a B2B environment, right? Which essentially allows me to, to bring in guest users from another Azure AD for that matter. So think of your organization and partners that you might have, service providers, customers that you might have, and the ability for you to bring them in and send them invites to your environment and sharing things like calendars with them. Possibly what you've got, if you've got something like Azure set up, just check my time here, something like Azure set up, and a whole bunch of virtual machines that you want to be managing. Maybe you've got an external partner that has got the skills to be managing your infrastructure. You can bring them in a business-to-business type fashion, which gives you access to that environment. We've also got a newish sort of service called B2B Direct Connect, which essentially allows you to establish a type of a trust between two Azure AD organizations, right? Which gives me some seamless collaboration between those two environments. And then we've also got, Azure AD Business to Consumer, which is essentially the ability for me to give access to resources to users that might sign in with something like, Google Identity, right? IBM Identity for that matter, or something like Facebook or something like that. So we've got a pretty solid B2B and a pretty solid B2C story as well, which is essentially what you might require to bring in external users, whether they are partners or whether they are consumer type users, and give them access to the environment. So, and this brings me up to multi-factor authentication, and I'll do a couple of demos in a bit. Multi-factor authentication is the ability for you to prompt the user for some additional information, usually based on some sort of a condition, right? In fact, if I access any of the Microsoft resources anywhere, right? Whenever I'm using my Microsoft identity, my corporate Microsoft identity, that is, I cannot do that without my mobile phone. I need to use my Authenticator app to do that. Right, so this is typically something that either the user knows, right, like a question that you've said to the user, which of these questions, do you have a solid answer for? What is your mother's maiden name, just as an example, right? So in other words, something that the user knows, something that they might have, to this end, it might be a code that you've sent to the user's mobile device, or something that they are, right? And to this end, it might be something like biometric information, a fingerprint, a retina scan. Nowadays, in fact, I don't think I've typed my Microsoft password in many months, because every time I sign in anywhere, I just look at my mobile phone and I, punch in a code and hit the yes button, and I'm signed in. So multi-factor authentication is that ability to bring your device, to send a code to your mobile phone, to ask the user some sort of a question. This is something that the user might typically set up front, and once they've set this up, you can then conditionally prompt the user for multi-factor authentication. We've also got some other forms and shapes of passwordless authentication. For example, something like Windows Hello, right? In the morning when I switch on my laptop here in my training room, I'm actually not typing in a password. I can either scan my finger on my laptop, right, which scans my fingerprint. Alternatively, if I just look at the screen, it'll allow me to sign in by looking at my face, right? So facial recognition capabilities. Certain laptops have this capability, right? So it's not available on every type of laptop. The laptop typically needs to, relatively new laptop. I think all laptops that have been built in the last 2 or 3 years will probably have this capability. But Windows Hello is that option that you have to essentially sign in with facial recognition features that might be built completely into your device itself. On top of that, we can also use things like the Authenticator app. You don't just have to use the Authenticator app from Microsoft. You can also opt to use a third-party Authenticator app, right? I know Google has also got an option like this. But alternatively, you can also use FIDO keys, right? And FIDO is that fast identity online, sort of protocols and standard that essentially allows me to either bring some sort of a key, like a physical key, like what might look like a little flash drive, for example, that I can tap or plug in or something like that. Or alternatively, it might actually be a key that's built onto my device that I've actually hooked up to the environment, right? So Azure AD allows authentication from all of those platforms. It's not just usernames, passwords, etc. And I will, by the way, we can also exclude multi-factor authentication for certain users, right? So I can be quite granular and quite specific as to who needs to use multi-factor authentication, but more importantly, when we want to enforce multi-factor authentication. It might be, just as an example, that you configure the environment to say that if my administrators are logging on from our network at the office, then don't prompt them for multi-factor authentication. But the minute they log on to the Azure portal from home or from a public network for that matter, then prompt them for multi-factor authentication, right? So that conditional access is something that I've also got a slide or two on that, and I'll see if I can also do a demo around that for you in a minute. And this brings me roughly up until about halfway here, and as per usual, we are going to give you 50% off your Azure Fundamentals exam if you're keen and interested in that. The way to do this would be to scan this QR code that you see on the screen right now. If you've scanned this QR code, it'll give you access to a form. You can complete your details there, and you can use that code that we've added there. And that code is essentially 17872, 72 being my favorite number, by the way. So if you punch in this information, from session number 4, if you attended 5 of the rest of the sessions, then you will essentially get 50% off the Azure Fundamentals exam. So
sorry, Johan, the code is wrong. Actually, the code for today is, I think this is the previous slide.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What is the code?
It's 17967.
Right, happy days. I've updated that.
Thank you.
That is quite, I'm pretty sure I took the slide from earlier on, but anyway, it is what it is. Again, you can get access to the to the exam and get 50% discount off the exam if you scan that QR code. Give us your details. We will ensure that we stay compliant with the information. We're not storing anything. We just want a list of the folks that have attended 5 of the last 7 sessions, right? And that's essentially that code 17967 that you need to punch in. I'll see if I can bring this up again towards the end. Apologies for that number being incorrectly there, ladies and gents. All right, so without me waffling any further around that, something else that we might also be doing with Azure AD is giving access to the environment, right? And you can see here, I know that the slide is not the best of quality, right? This image, I had to stretch it a little bit to get a little bit more sort of real estate going on the screen here. But if you remember, we spoke about this, about 2 or 3 sessions ago, where we spoke about an Azure structure, right? So I also use role-based access control, which is essentially taking my identity and my role from Azure AD and giving access to the environment, right? So role-based access control is that process where I decide who needs what level of access to my Azure environment, and I can then go and assign the permissions at a certain level. I'd like to quickly demo this for you if it's all the same to everyone. I'm going to go to my Azure environment, and you'll see if I go and search for management groups, I've got a couple of management groups there. There's an IT management group. In that, I've got a test management group, and there's a training, a subscription. If I click on the training subscription, let me just bump the font slightly. You'll see that I've got this access control option here, right? So in there, I can either go and check my access, or I can click on role assignments, and I can go and add a new role assignment. And in this instance, I might want to give someone the ability to read, the ability to contribute. There's owner permissions. Owner permissions, by the way, if you're not sure, is very similar to contributor permissions, except if I'm an owner, I can also give someone access, right? The contributor can do everything except give someone access to the environment, right? So I might say I want to make someone a contributor here. It's prompting me here for who I actually want to give access. So the role is the what you can do. The member is the who can do this. And I might go and say that this AAD lab user 1 is going to have this permission, and I can click on the next button and click on review and assign, and within a few seconds, it's failed to add that because it's already existing there. All right, well, hello, that makes sense. So you can see that that I've got that role assignment already. If I click on, well, let me just see where it is. There you can see contributor, and this user already has that role. In fact, I can go and add another role assignment and make this user an owner if I wanted to. And you'll see that this will essentially allow me to override, to give additional sort of permissions. And the permissions on Azure AD, the RBAC side of Azure, is additive. In other words, if I give you read permissions and I give you contributor permissions, you will always have contributor permissions. If I give you contributor permissions at a higher level and I give you read permissions at a lower level, you will still have contributor permissions. The only way to get rid of those permissions is by applying what's known as a deny assignment. And a deny assignment can currently only get implemented by implementing something called Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints is cognizant of the resources that you are deploying. It looks at the role-based access, and it also looks at the Azure policies that you might want to apply to that. All right, so deny assignments, you can override the permissions in the hierarchical structure by using something called Azure Blueprints. It's the only way to do that right now. And then you can also see check access, and you'll see that if I click on check access and I find this user of mine, then you'll see here the user has got contributor permissions on this resource, contributor permissions, or owner permissions rather, also on this resource. And this implies if I scroll down to my resource groups and click on my 500 resource group, just as an example, then you'll see if I click on view access and sort of search for for example, well, check access rather, and look for this a user of mine, then you can see this user has got inherited permissions, right? The permissions, the contributor role was applied at the subscription level. So in other words, it was inherited here. The owner permissions were also applied at subscription levels. In other words, it was inherited here. But at the key vault level, it's got access to this resource specifically. And I've given this user access directly into the key vault. Right, so role-based access control is that ability for you to assign permissions in this hierarchical Azure structure that we've been talking about kind of since day one, in a sense. So then what is conditional access, right? And conditional access is that ability that we can decide under which conditions do we either give access or not access, or do we require some additional authentication mechanism? For example, we might create a conditional access policy that implies that the minute a guest account accesses the portal, it doesn't matter from where, that the guest user also has to use multi-factor authentication, right? In other words, answer a question, log in with their mobile devices, wait for a code to be sent to the mobile device, etc. Right? So conditional access is split into these three sort of areas, right? Where first of all, we've got some sort of a signal, and the signal is the criteria that we are talking about. So for example, what is the user location? If the location is not a trusted location, it might be a high-risk sign-in. And if it's a high-risk sign-in, we might decide to enforce multi-factor authentication. So if I go back to the portal here and I click on conditional access, let me just bump the font down slightly, then you'll see that there's something called named locations, and I can go and create all these named locations, either add some countries, IP ranges. This as an example, there you can see there's a country called South Africa. So I can go and add these locations, and then I can go and build out my policies to specify that under these circumstances, you can see there I can go and create a new policy, and under these circumstances, if for example if the following conditions are met, the user risk is too high, the sign-in risk is of a certain level, the device that's being used, the location, if the location is in South Africa, for example, or whatever those signals and criteria is, and this gives me a very granular sort of access control mechanism to ensure that under whatever conditions we require, the user is prompted for additional signing. The user is not allowed to access the environment, for example. So think again of that scenario where I mentioned someone signs in from Australia, and 20 minutes later they sign in from a location inside of South Africa. That's a very risky sign-in, right? Doesn't sound right. It's impossible to travel that fast. So under those conditions, we might just say, well, we are not going to give someone access if those conditions are met. So conditional access policies is a great way for you to, decide under what exact conditions do you consider the risk to be too high, and you want to maybe not allow access or prompt for some additional mechanism for the user to authenticate. So that's the conditional access, which includes the signal, the decision, and then the action, either allow, enforce, multi-factor authentication, etc. Now, what we implement is we implement zero trust, right? And this is an initiative that's grown over time inside of Microsoft, where where we're really taking security at all levels and at all times during our software development lifecycle really, really seriously. What we mean by zero trust is three things. First of all, that we explicitly verify based on data points. In other words, based on information that we know, right, the user has just logged in from 2 locations with a time span that's impossible, that's a data point that should raise alarm. So zero in on data points, and based on those data points, always authenticate, right? This is different from how things used to work in the past. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, the minute you were on your network at the office, we kind of assumed everything is okay, right? So if I sign in on my laptop at our offices on that network, that gives me access to whatever I want to access. So with zero trust, we're essentially saying that the data points can be very granular, and we don't just assume that you should have access based on your user account, right? Under certain conditions, we want to verify explicitly that you are who you say you are. We also implement the concept of least privilege. And what we mean by least privilege here is you'll see just in time access. What we mean by just-in-time access is by default, you don't have the ability to do certain things. You need to first ask for the ability. We will then enable the ability, and then you can do, then you can do what you want to do, but only for a period of time. And also JEA, or just enough admin permissions, right? So always make sure that your users have enough to do what they need to do, but make sure when they need to do something that they typically need to elevate their permissions. So ensure that the concept of least privilege is always in play. And that implies that your user might be a user administrator in your organization, but they are not logging onto the environment with those permissions constantly enabled, right? That if I needed to manage users, that I escalate my permissions to get that level of access, and then I can do the work that I need to do. And then after a period of time, those permissions will be removed from me once again. I'm going to give you a quick example of this, if it's all the same to you. What I've got here is I've got, just-in-time administration. And if I go for sign into a new in-private window here, I'm going to sign in here with this Azure AD lab user that I created earlier on, right? There you can see there's my Active Directory environment. There's my users. And you'll notice that I can only create a new user here because I've actually asked for the right permissions. And if I go, for example, for Azure AD privileges, you'll see that there's my roles. If I look at active assignments, then you'll see that I've got this assignment of user administrator is active. I can deactivate this, and you'll see there within a few seconds, it will deactivate this. I enabled it just before I started the session today. So if I go back again to my users and click on new user here, let me just refresh this quickly. It'll work in a few seconds, but you'll see in a few seconds that permission will actually be revoked, and I will not be able to create the new user at this point in time. So that field will actually get grayed out, right? So if I go back to my my different roles here, you can click on active assignments. It's not active right now, so let me just try that again. I'm going to go to Active Directory, click on my users, and you'll see it's actually grayed out now, right? So this user, this AAD lab user of mine, has been made a user administrator, but he doesn't work in the default permission set of having user administrator permissions. I'm using privileged identity management to enforce him to escalate his permissions when he needs it. So if I go back in here again and click on eligible assignments and click on the activate button, you'll see by default it's going to give me 8 hours. But if I wanted to, I can even bump it down to 1 hour, right? And hit the activate button. I need it to access and manage my users. Click on activate. You will see within a few seconds, stage 1, it's processing that request. It's validating that your activation is successful. That'll just also take a few seconds. And then you'll see activation completed successfully, also a few seconds. And if I hit the refresh button here now, then you will see that, and in fact, it will take a few seconds again. Let me just refresh again. I'm going to crack open a new browser window here. So let's go for my users and click on users. And you'll see that now my user has got those elevated permissions, and those elevated permissions will only be available for 1 hour, right? So this is what we refer to when we say just-in-time access. Your user might be a user administrator, but they are not going to operate in the environment with those elevated permissions all the time. And that gives you that just-in-time access to, the resources that you need to manage. And then also the last thing on zero trust is assume breach, right? Always ensure that if someone has got permissions to do something, that they don't necessarily include other types of permissions that might give them access somewhere else, right? And to this end, we're implying that you want to minimize the blast radius. And with blast radius, we're implying that you want to segment and segregate access properly and quite at a granular level. So if I have got access to perform certain functions, we want to limit it just to the functions that I really need, right? So that if my account is compromised, that maybe you've got access to my personal email for that matter, but not by default to something else in the environment, right? So you want to create these sort of gates, if you like, and segment access in the environment so that once I have my permission, it doesn't give me access to, to control everything that I might be able to control if I have, done multifactor authentication, for example, right? So this is this concept of zero trust. Verify explicitly, always operate on the least privilege, and always assume breach. And what we mean by that is, always assume that the user is going to do something malicious in a sense. And I know that sounds quite bad, but that's essentially what we're saying. Now I've got the slide on defense in depth. I'm probably going to see if I can do a little bit more of a demo, but all we are referring to with defense in depth is the ability for you and the requirement of ensuring that security is thought about in all aspects, right? So think about the OSI layer. You can even think about it like that. Physical security, right? Identity and access, perimeter, network, compute, application and data. So if you contrast this to the OSI layer, where we've also got sort of different layers on our networking areas, you want to ensure that there's defense in depth on that OSI layers as well, right? Including on all of these components: your physical security, access to the data center and the physical servers, identity and access, your perimeter, your network, for example, the compute components, the actual virtual machines, and on top of that, your application and data, right? So this is essentially going to minimize your attack surface and gives you a great opportunity to ensure that you've got everything thought, everything as secure as you possibly can at all sorts of levels. What we've seen happen, and this is the benefit of running your cloud infrastructure on your behalf from a Microsoft perspective, is we see that certain things work well for certain customers. So when you're running your workload inside of Azure, we're we've got your eyes on your security, but you've also got our eyes on your security, right? And Azure includes a whole bunch of different services. We've got we've got distributed denial of service protection that is always available and always on. We've got an enhanced DDoS capability that where there's a cost involved that will also do a little bit more in-depth sort of DDoS protection on top of the standard options that we've got out there. But we include security at all of these layers, right? Not just at data center layer, but even at network layer, right? We've got network security groups at network layer. We've got a perimeter protection with DDoS, etc. We've even got just-in-time access for compute, right, for virtual machines. And to this end, I would like to maybe just end off with a bit of an additional demo, if I can. So what I've got here is I've got Azure Active Directory. You will see that there is my users, right? And I can go and create a new user, or I can invite the user. I'm using my account here, so I've got all permissions at this point in time. But there you can also see things like groups, right? And I can go and create a new group if I wanted to, like a security group, give it a name, and you'll notice that I can specify my group membership based on a dynamic user, right? So if I add a dynamic query, I can dynamically populate this group by specifying that, hey, look, if the city, equals Johannesburg, right, then add the user into this group. So these properties are essentially all the criteria that can be attached to a user, right? So I can, for example, specify everyone that has got this job title, everyone that works in this department, everyone who's got Joe Soap for a manager must be part of this group, right? So that's essentially our group management, and we've got some options around that. You'll notice here that we've got some external identities, and there's my external collaboration settings where I can go and specify that we are either going to allow or deny invitations to the following specified domains, right? So we can go and specify that we are going to allow invitations to be sent to any domain, or only allow, invitations to, contoso.com as an example, right? And this is where we essentially specify what our external collaborations in a B2B, B2C type scenario is going to be. We've also got things called administrative units, and administrative units is essentially allowing me to group and segregate certain users and certain administrators in my organization. If you were a conglomerate, for example, and you've got multiple companies in your organization, you might have company A with administrator A that only manages the users from company A, right? And you can use admin units to actually do that, right? Just to group together or segregate certain users and administrators. For example, you might have a geo sort of distributed organization where you've got certain folks in South Africa and certain folks in the UK. You might create your administrators in South Africa to only manage the users in South Africa, right? The folks in the administrators in the UK only manage the folks in the UK. And I can also dynamically populate those administrative units with users and groups based on those criteria that I just showed you, right? If the country location for the user is UK, place him in this group. So all of that's also possible. The last thing I want to just quickly outline is app registrations, right? So everything we spoke about so far related predominantly to user management and to access control. But we can also create something called app registrations. And with app registrations, you'll notice that we've essentially got a client ID and we've got a tenant ID. And the combination of these is something I can embed in my custom application and essentially ensure that Azure AD knows I'm signed into my application and that it's an application that we want to identify. So I can, for example, give someone access to the key vault to access secrets in the key vault, but only if the user is accessing the key vault using application A, right? So we're not just managing users and devices, we're also managing your custom applications using these registered applications. And then, yeah, that's pretty much that. The last thing I wanted to also share with you just briefly is, we've got different SKUs for Azure AD. We've got the free Azure AD that's essentially limited in terms of the number of objects you can have in there. But then we've also got an Office 365, SKU. And then we've got an Azure AD Premium P1 and P2 plans. And based on the plan you've got, you will see that there's, for example, identity protection. You require the P2 plan for that. Entitlement management, you require the P2 plan for that. Remember MFA for trusted devices. You can use almost any of them to do that, right? So it's worth looking at these requirements and understanding what users require, what sort of level of license for you to manage your Azure AD environment. And that brings me essentially to the end of the session, ladies and gents. We covered what Azure AD is. We spoke about hybrid and external identities. We touched on multi-factor and role-based access control and conditional access. And then we ended off talking a little bit about zero trust and defense in depth. Let's see if there are any questions.
Yes, so we have our first question. In my day-to-day work, I have very little rights access to work with, mess with Azure AD dev work. What is exam focus on AD management / configuration?
So in the exam, you would probably not have to worry about working with these different components. I reckon that if you're writing the administrator exam, you would have to worry about actually, the PowerShell side of things, actually doing some of these things. For this specific exam, as long as you understand what these things are. So you can do a lot worse than just make a list of the different components here. Multi-factor authentication, what is it? Conditional access, what is it? And that's essentially all they're going to be testing as far as this exam is concerned. As if you know what the concept is. So no practical access, or they will not test anything practically. They will just want to understand if you know what these things are, and that's really all in the content. I hope that answers that question, Christoph.
Then same question, is there a public available lab one can experiment with as a prep for the exam?
There actually is, and if you go and search for free Azure subscription, you will notice that we've actually got a free Azure subscription. All right. The free subscription will give you a bunch of services over a period of time. Some of these services will stay available for you forever because certain features of Azure is essentially free for, there's certain components that will be free. But this will essentially prompt you for your credit card information when you sign up for the account. But you can take my word for it. We will not, after the 1 year, convert this over to a pay-as-you-go subscription without you going in and clicking, I want a pay-as-you-go subscription. So essentially, after the 1 year, your subscription will just stop working with the paid-for services, and the free services will continue. So even though you've added your credit card at the beginning when you sign up for the free one, this is not something that you have to go and do. I see there's a question about can you add that link, but the reality is if you just search for the term free Azure account, then you will eventually find this page. It should be one of your top 2 link results. But yeah, so this will give you a free subscription linked to your personal account, and you can play around there as to your heart's content. Be mindful though that with Azure, you will notice. Let me just quickly go in here and show you what I mean by this. So if I go for licenses, you will notice that there's a get a free trial option. So by default, you will get the free version of Azure AD, if I'm not mistaken. you can go and activate, a trial of the P2 plan, but you can only do this once and it'll only last for 30 days. So make sure that when you enable this feature on your free account, that you go and play with these features in that month so that it doesn't kind of expire and then you can never enable it again, right? So that's something that you might want to be mindful of. I hope that answered that question as well. Any other questions? See, there's one. Are there cases of when you don't want to use dynamic users? I'm presuming, Kevin, that you are referring to dynamic, membership of groups, right? Is that correct? Unless I don't understand what you mean by dynamic users. I'm not sure if I mentioned the word dynamic users at any point in time. So in certain areas, if I'm going to assume that we are talking about dynamic groups, right? So in certain instances, you want your groups, think of departments, right? If I change department, I want my marketing department group to automatically include all the people that work in the marketing department. That's something that you want to keep dynamic. But if you think, for example, of the group of users that are supposed to manage your SAP infrastructure in Azure, all the virtual machines related to SAP, that is something that you probably don't want to make dynamic. Because if someone accidentally adds you into the SAP, as a SAP consultant, and that is the rule that you check for, suddenly you've got access to the resources, right? So certain instances, you should be looking at dynamic groups. Certain instances, you probably don't want to look at dynamic groups, especially if it comes to giving people access, So I hope that makes sort of sense, right? Access control, you should think twice about using dynamic groups unless you know exactly what you want and you can keep those rules sort of tied down exactly to what they should be, right? But I would think twice before I give someone access to for example, all my accounting systems and resources inside of Azure just because their department reads, accounting. So the criteria should be really well defined if you want to control access like that. As per usual, ladies and gents, feel free to reach out to me. You've got my details. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any further questions. I hope this time was worth your, this session was worth your time and that you learned a couple of things. Let's, if you have any further questions, reach out to me. Other than that, I'll hopefully see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.